Hello, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. We are here in Washington, D.C. at the International Campaign for Tibet. My name is Matteo Mecacci, I'm the president, and here is Bhuchung Tsering, our vice president. So we are here today to talk about a new initiative that is just beginning its progress in the US Congress. As you may have seen already from our website or other posts that we have done on social media, in the House of Representatives, a bill was introduced last week by Jim McGovern, a Democrat from Massachusetts, who is also the chairman of the Congressional Executive Commission on China, and has been also the author of many initiatives on Tibet for a number of years. And this bill basically addresses the issue of US policy on Tibet overall, and for this reason is going to update and strengthen the Tibetan Policy Act of 2002. The Tibetan Policy Act of 2002 was also a congressional initiative on which ICT was heavily involved at the time. Also, the Special Envoy of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Lodi Gyari, was the executive chair of ICT. And that was the first major legislation that was passed on the Tibetan issue in the early 2000s, which also led to a number of years of and round of dialogues between the Chinese side and the Tibetan representatives of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So why this is important today? This bill was introduced building on the success that was last year represented by the passage of the Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act. That legislation basically presented the issue of Tibet as something that is inherently in the interest of the United States of America, because that bill wants to promote access to Tibet, more access to Tibet for American citizens, whether they are diplomats, journalists, NGOs, or Tibetans or Americans of Tibetan descent. And this has been the first kind of legislation that has tried to address the question of Tibet also from a local point of view, from the point of view of citizens who have a cultural or social or religious interest in Tibet, whether it's Tibetan Buddhism or Tibetan culture. And so through this bill, the challenge to China's policy is from a domestic and local point of view. So this addresses also the question that China always raises of interference in China's internal affairs. And this is something that we'll address also later on this bill. So based on that success of the passage of the bill that was signed by President Trump at the end of last year, and which is now going to be implemented by the end of this year, because the State Department basically will have to present a list of Chinese officials who are preventing access to Tibet for American citizens and sanction them with visa denial to come to the United States based on the principle of reciprocity. So this was an important step. But building on that, last March we continued our tradition, which we have been carrying on over the last 5 years, of organizing a strategy meeting on the Hill, which has been hosted generously and forcefully, as always, by now Speaker Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House of Representatives. And at those meetings, we had an opportunity to discuss with key leaders of Congress what would be the next steps. And clearly from that discussion, where Chairman McGovern was present, and Chairman Engel from the Foreign Affairs Committee, Chris Smith from the Republican Party, basically the consensus emerged that the question of religious freedom and reincarnation and succession to His Holiness the Dalai Lama needed to be addressed, because China has already clearly not only stated in statement, but also passing regulations in China that would make it basically the selection of the next Dalai Lama something controlled by the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party. But by addressing that issue, and so making sure that it's up to the Tibetan people and to the Dalai Lama himself to decide how the succession process is going to play out. There was a decision also to look at the overall US policy on Tibet, and the need was felt that it needed to be strengthened and updated. And so we're going to talk about this today, the content of the bill, and also about the next steps that we are going to take to try to make sure that we can, as I said, building on the success of last year's campaign to pass the reciprocal access to Tibet, to replicate and have also this passed in the next months or year before the 2020 elections. So the bill, as I said, touches upon a number of issues. There is the question of religious freedom and the succession to His Holiness the Dalai Lama. There is the question of diplomatic representation in Tibet for the U.S. Government. There is the question of supporting democracy in exile, which is the Central Tibetan Administration. There is the question of the environment and water security in Tibet, which is something that clearly now is slowly getting more attention internationally, because Tibet is considered the third pole, the third most important reservoir of fresh water besides the two poles, the north and the south pole. And also there are also provisions related to the behavior and policies and businesses of U.S. companies in Tibet, and how this is gonna affect, whether positively or negative, Tibetans who live there, and also overall strengthening the office of the Special Coordinator for Tibet. So I will start here now asking Bhuchung specifically also, and naturally as a Tibetan, what is the importance of having the U.S. Congress introducing and hopefully later on passing norms that address the issue of the succession of His Holiness the Dalai Lama?
Yeah, this bill touches on the issue of succession in the context of the religious freedom of the Tibetan people, and it has two components. First is the policy. If adopted and when adopted, this bill lays out the United States policy, being that the United States supports the Tibetan people's tradition, which is that the Dalai Lama, the current 14th Dalai Lama, and the Tibetan Buddhists are the only ones who have authority in deciding on the issue of the reincarnation system of the Tibetan Buddhist follow leaders in general, and in particular the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama. So this will be a clear policy of the United States. With such a policy, then the second component is, if, as the Chinese are trying to do, if they interfere in this fundamentally Tibetan Buddhist process, and if they do anything that sort of negates the authority of the Tibetan Buddhists, then the United States will take action under existing laws and regulations in the United States, or which would mean that those Chinese officials identified as being violating the Tibetan religious process will face their assets being seized in the United States, or if they plan to come to the United States, they will not be allowed to come to the United States. So these would be some of the aspects on the issue of religious freedom and succession.
Yeah.
And so
why is this so important?
So this is important because for the Tibetan Buddhist people, when I say Tibetan Buddhists, it's not just Tibetan people, but followers of Tibetan Buddhism, which goes all along the Himalayan region in the Indian subcontinent, as far as Mongolia and the Russian Republic, and today even in the West, where there are many followers of Tibetan Buddhism. They are all stakeholders, including
many ICT members and people who are watching.
You are all stakeholders in this issue about the future of the Tibetan reincarnation system. Yeah. And therefore, the Congress is doing something to protect the religious rights of these Tibetan Buddhist followers, and therefore that's important in general. Secondly, to Tibetan people, the Tibetan people have a very unique historical bond between themselves and the Dalai Lama. And so that bond is continued for the last more than 300 years through a unique system of tradition of recognizing the next reincarnation of the Dalai Lama. So here now through this bill, the United States is trying to protect that bond between the Tibetan people and the Dalai Lama, so that a communist government like that of the current Chinese government cannot and should not be interfering in that process. So broadly, these are the two importance of this.
Yeah, I will just read briefly two norms from the bill, which is actually HR 4331 that you can find also on the website of the International Campaign for Tibet, savetibet.org. If you go to the news section, you can find the text. And the two norms about this topic say that basically the State Department and the United States government will oppose any effort by the government of the People's Republic of China to identify or install Tibetan Buddhist religious leader in a manner inconsistent with the established religious practice and system of Tibetan Buddhism, and ensure that the identification and installation of Tibetan Buddhist religious leaders, including a future 15th Dalai Lama, is determined solely within the Tibetan Buddhist faith community in accordance with universally recognized right to religious freedom. So I think this is very clear.
Exactly. And this is part of the broader United States policy that's already there in the 2002 Tibetan Policy Act, which says the United States should help preserve and promote Tibetan people's distinct identity, culture, and way of life.
Yeah.
So in that context, in addition to that, another is at the diplomatic level, what is the United States doing for the people of Tibet? Now this new bill has components on that the United States Embassy in China doing something, and including opening up a consulate in Lhasa. So can you expand more on what that aspect of the bill symbolizes?
That is important, and I would say also what is significant for this bill that I didn't mention before. It is not new that the U.S. Congress or the State Department have asserted, the right of Tibetan Buddhists to enjoy religious freedom and also not to interfere in the selection of the Dalai Lama. We have seen statements by senators, by State Department, Ambassador Brownback. But by adopting legislation, this will be mandatory for the State Department. So it's not just a statement, it's not just a political position, but it's something that the State Department and the White House will have to.
And to also, I'm sorry for interrupting, but just today, as we are speaking, the Undersecretary nominee of the State Department was at his confirmation hearing, Marshall Billingsley, and he referred to Tibet as being an important issue in the Congress.
Exactly. And you were talking about the diplomatic representation also in Tibet for the United States. Also, this has been a long-standing request by the United States, government to open a U.S. consulate in Lhasa, not only to assist U.S. citizens who travel there, and there are many who, try to go to Tibet despite, restrictions, but also to be able to assess the situation directly, because the Chinese government has been saying for decades that everything is fine in Tibet, but for some reason they do not allow foreign governments to be present there. So this is something that I think is very clear, is a request that fits within U.S. interest in the region to be aware of what the situation in Tibet is. But in addition to that, I think now with this legislation, this is part of a process that I was referring before about the need to have reciprocity between the United States and China. And so what this bill does, it says clearly that unless there is the opportunity for the U.S. government to open a U.S. consulate in Lhasa, no other Chinese consulate will be open in the United States. So that links, basically the question of increased diplomatic, exchanges and representation between U.S. and China to the issue of Tibet. And this also shows why this is, considered important, because now the U.S. government is saying you're not going to have any other Chinese consulate in the United States, which Beijing has been requesting also for a while, unless you allow the U.S. to be present in Tibet. So I think that's quite significant. That is going to be part of legislation and not just a statement.
Yeah, and until the opening of the Lhasa consulate takes place, the bill says that in the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, there should be a separate Tibet section that will deal with all Tibetan affairs. So this is again strengthening on the Tibetan Policy Act of 2002.
That's very important. And talking about diplomatic representation, and democratic efforts to institutionalize the issue. You have also been working in the past for the Central Tibetan Administration. And so this bill also refers to new norms that acknowledge the role that the CTA plays in representing the Tibetan people's aspiration all over the world. I think this is the kind of working they have. But also the Dalai Lama, even there, has played a major role over the years. So can you expand?
So the bill sends two important messages on the matters of Tibetan democratic system of governance. First of all, it sort of updates on the 2002 Tibetan Policy Act, because at that time, His Holiness the Dalai Lama was both the spiritual and the temporal leader of the Tibetan people. But in between, in 2011, the Dalai Lama fully devolved his political authority to a Tibetan elected governmental system. And so today, the Tibetan people have this increased democratization, or they're undergoing an experiment in increased democratization. And so the bill recognizes that positive Tibetan governance experience and commends His Holiness the Dalai Lama for doing this, taking this initiative. Secondly, now that there is a directly elected Tibetan political leadership in the form of the Central Tibetan Administration, the bill also sort of recognizes that legitimate entity as an organization that represents the Tibetan interest throughout the world. So therefore, I think in a way, this bill confirms, or is an official confirmation of the fact that the Tibetan democratization process is one that should be the future way of governance of the Tibetan people, unlike the way the Chinese authorities are governing the Tibetan people there.
And also, I would add that having also been working on these issues, with other minorities, other groups all over the world, I think what needs to be noticed here, also for the people who are watching, is that the Tibetan community in exile has really set an example also for other movements, because they have been able over these many decades to stay united, naturally thanks to the leadership and the moral authority of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. But not only that, also trying to build institutions, as you're referring to, that can represent a way to develop a policy and also resolve conflicts, which always exist in any community, whether in a Western society or in Asian society. Democracy is the way to go, or to try to resolve these issues. So I think that is also significant for the U.S. Congress to stress this, because we know that in international relations, often the movements who take the most radical actions, they get the attention because they use violence, they use threats to try to gain political leverage. We have just seen recently with what's happening in Afghanistan and the Taliban while they were negotiating, and all the reactions using violence to try to gain leverage. So it's not only about democracy, it's also the choice of non-violence as the way to resolve the conflict, both with China, but also internally in a way, if there are conflicts within the society.
Yeah, coincidentally, when we talk about Tibetan democracy, tomorrow, that's September 20th, the Tibetan Parliament in exile is starting another session. And during this session, they will be scrutinizing the reports of the administration led by Sikyong Lobsang Sengke. So we can see that the Tibetan democracy is not just there in theory, but also in practice. And in the coming days, we'll see that out in the media as to what the parliamentarians are trying to do about this aspect of the Tibetan issue. But if I take you to inside Tibet, one of the concerns of Tibetan people and the Tibetan issue as a whole is about the environment of the Tibetan plateau, on the Tibetan plateau. So this bill has certain provision which draws our attention to the environment in Tibet. Can you expand on that?
Yes. As you said, the concern about the preservation of the environment on the Tibetan plateau has been there for many, many years, and unfortunately the lack of access to Tibet has prevented also research and serious interventions by international institutions, which are now looking at the environmental issues from a global perspective, because there is only one environment. There is not the Tibetan environment. There is the global environment, which is now
borderless.
Yes, exactly, and which is now under threat. But the ecosystem in Tibet is very fragile. And so this bill tries tries to address that, taking note of the many critical elements which are there. We have talked about water. The glaciers in Tibet are, the main source of these major rivers that, according to research, serve over 1 billion people across Asia. So the rivers in Tibet are not only important for the Tibetan people or the Chinese people in that regard. They are important for India. They are important for Southeast Asian countries. Just to mention 2 rivers that come from Tibet, the Mekong and the Brahmaputra. So these rivers serve really hundreds of millions of people that depend on the preservation of the environment in Tibet. There is the question of the relocation of nomads. The nomads have been, part of the Tibetan way of life for hundreds of years, and they have been able to preserve the environment. Now, with the Chinese policies, developmental policy in Tibet, we have seen also the forced relocation of nomads as a way presented by China to protect the environment, and so relocating them, forcibly in settlements, which are, in a way, an excuse to try to control more the Tibetan people and are not serving the interest of preserving the environment. But, coming down to the bill, basically, this is an area where the United States is seeking also a way to cooperate with China, because it is also in China's interest to protect the environment. We know that there are concerns of Chinese environmentalists about the pollution in China. Some of the cities in China are barely livable in terms of, air pollution and so forth. So Tibet is one area that it can be important for the world, and where there could be cooperation with China. So there are some mechanisms like the Lower Mekong Initiative, which is an intergovernmental forum where the preservation of the Mekong River is discussed, where there could be opportunities for exchanges and involving also Tibetan environmentalists in the discussion. Unfortunately, so far, China has refused to join regional frameworks or international conventions for the protection of rivers. So this is a big obstacle. But I think it's important to highlight that. And as I said, this would be a way also for other governments all over the world who are concerned about the environment to start looking at what the situation in Tibet is and why this is critical, for global interests, not just for the Tibetan people or the Chinese government or the Chinese people.
And talking about intergovernmental initiatives,
yeah.
The Tibetan environment is already being talked about at the policymaking or in the policymaking circles in the context of United States Indo-Pacific strategy,
yeah.
where water on the Tibetan plateau is playing an important role in the situation in downstream countries in South and Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
And so that is where we feel that the bill, again, by focusing on water, puts that issue of Tibetan water in the context of U.S. national interest, because
exactly.
the Indo-Pacific issue is very much related to American national
and actually
interest.
American national interest. And we now know, the debate these days is about what's happening in Saudi Arabia and Iran and the attack on oil facilities. Many experts now say that next wars can be about water, because the water scarcity is going to be an issue that is going to affect many countries. So Tibet plays a big role, and since the United States has a strong focus on national security issues all over the world, I think we see an increased interest also from the U.S. Congress to look at Tibet not just as a human rights or religious freedom issue, but also something that fits within global interest and U.S. interest, which is
the Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act is very much part of that thinking.
It's part of that, and I think that goes against clearly what the Chinese continue to say. And just today we saw a reaction from the Chinese Foreign Ministry to the introduction of the bill in the U.S. Congress, and I can summarize the position, but basically what the Chinese ministry is saying, this Tibet is only something that China should think about, and Tibetan Buddhism is something that only the Chinese government is concerned about, and so the U.S. should not get involved. Why this position doesn't make sense?
Yeah, I think that goes to the fundamental issue on why the Tibetan issue continues to be remain unresolved, despite the fact that the initiative that the Dalai Lama has is being seen as reasonable, pragmatic throughout the world. It's because the Chinese government tries to ignore the fact that there is a Tibetan issue. And rather than trying to address the underlying grievances, as the United Nations representative said during the 2008 demonstrations in Tibet, rather than trying to understand the underlying grievances, the Chinese want to ignore the issue of Tibet. So, in which case, now that the bill has been introduced in the House and very soon in the Senate, what is ICT's plan in terms of moving forward? And what can our members do to help?
And this is where everybody gets involved here. So what is needed now, I think, is build on this momentum that has been created by both the passage of last year's bill and now the work that has been done over the last few months to introduce this bill, and really show to members of Congress and to the leadership, both in the House and the Senate, that this is an issue that concerns the American people. We know that this is true. Opinion polls in the United States clearly say that the U.S. citizens are on the side of the Tibetan people. They highly respect and love His Holiness the Dalai Lama, but that's not enough. We need to act. We need to show that there is a political constituency that wants to make this part of U.S. Policy and U.S. priorities in their dealing with China. We know that U.S.-China relations are at the moment a critical moment, specifically on question related to economic issues, but we see also movement and concerns about the human rights situation in East Turkestan with the Uyghur people, the situation in Hong Kong, the situation in Tibet. So I think Tibet supporters and Tibetan people living all over the world and specifically in the United States need to mobilize. And the first goal that we have is to increase rapidly the number of co-sponsors, because that will show that there are hundreds of bills introduced in the House and the Senate every year. Only very few make it to the end. Very, very few. So it is very important to increase the number of co-sponsors, and in order to do that, we will organize both online with an option for our members and supporters to write to their members of Congress and senators, asking them to co-sponsor the bill, but also with what we call a mini lobby day that we will do in the third week of October, in which we will organize both here in DC, but also, most importantly, locally, in all 50 states, to contact members of the House and the Senate, asking them to support. This is very important because, as I said, Washington is a place where there are many groups, many lobbyists. There are so many that you can't even imagine. And in order to be able to make a difference, we need to show that there is a large support, an active support by citizens that live all over the country, not just in Washington, D.C.
And it's an opportunity for all people concerned with Tibet and people in the Tibet movement to work as a team to help, to use this opportunity to move the Tibet movement's objective, to reach the objective and to move to the next level. Just today, we have had a meeting with the Office of Tibet in terms of understanding their strategy on what they want to do, because they have been taking steps on this. Now, the Tibetan associations are an integral part of what happened with the reciprocal access to Tibet. The Tibetan American community has played a very important role. ICT, there are other Tibet groups there. We all should be working
from Free
together.
Tibet Youth Congress, yes.
Exactly. So we should be coordinating our effort, because this is an opportunity for us to directly and concretely challenge what China is doing in Tibet in a positive way, so that if this bill is adopted, it'll start looking to the future and prepare us for all eventualities if the Chinese authorities don't resolve the issue of Tibet.
And we can attest here, because we have seen it, that even last year when we were campaigning for the passage of the reciprocal access to Tibet, especially in the Senate, there were moments in which, because in the Senate you need, most of the time you need unanimous consent from all members of the Senate to pass legislation, in which there are members who are not fully aware senators were not fully aware, or they put a hold on a bill, etc. And local mobilization has made a difference. Has made a difference to make it pass through that time, and it has happened before. So this is not something which is cosmetic that we are doing just to to show that we are active. It really has an impact, and sometimes it takes a phone call, it takes a letter to make a member of Congress realize why Tibet matters to them, why it is important, because there is a constituent maybe who can't travel back to Tibet to see their family. We have many cases in the United States, or there are religious practitioners who cannot travel to Tibet because of the restrictions put there. So this is something that I think everybody can get engaged in. You can check our website. We have constant updates on safetibet.org, here on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. We will continue to post information and update you about the upcoming mini Tibet Lobby Day and the online mobilization that we will do at that point. And also for the online mobilization, not only you can send the letters to the congressmen or senators, but we will print all the letters and the petition and deliver them physically to the offices here, requesting meetings with the relevant staffers to talk.
And the bill number again is HR 4331. It's in the House right now. In the Senate, it will be introduced very soon when we'll have the number for you. It encapsulates both policy and programmatic support for Tibet by the United States Congress. In 2002 TPA, it didn't have some of the programmatic support that the United States renders to the Tibetan people. So now this bill includes those things, both inside Tibet and in the diaspora community. So therefore, it's important for all our members and anybody who's watching us today to write to your members of Congress and ask them to co-sponsor HR 4331, and that will make a difference.
Okay. Thank you very much for watching, and we look forward to updating you. So stay tuned both on Facebook and all the other social media.
And Tujiche.
And Tujiche. Thank you.